Have you ever done something so small that you forgot about it the next moment, only to realize later it changed everything? Stay with me until the end of this story, because what happened after one quiet act of kindness will circle back in a way you won't see coming. The night it began was colder than anyone expected, the kind of cold that slips through cracked windows and thin walls and settles into your bones. Sarah pulled her coat tighter as she locked the door of her tiny apartment, already regretting agreeing to work the late shift at the diner. Winter had come early this year, and the city felt different after dark, quieter, heavier, like it was holding its breath. As she walked, she thought about how little she had: a barely warm apartment, a job that paid just enough, and a life that felt stuck in place since her mother passed away the year before. That night, exhaustion weighed on her more than usual, and all she wanted was to finish her shift, get home, and wrap herself in the old blanket her mother had stitched years ago, the one thing that still smelled faintly of home. The diner was slow, the kind of slow where time stretches and thoughts wander. Near closing, Sarah noticed him through the foggy window. A man sitting on the curb across the street, shoulders hunched, hands shaking as he tried to rub warmth into them. He had no coat, just a thin sweater, and even from inside she could see his lips were pale. Something in her chest tightened. She tried to look away, telling herself all the usual things someone else would help. It wasn't her responsibility. She couldn't save everyone, but the image of her mother's face kept surfacing. The way she used to say, "If you can help and you don't, you carry that weight forever." When her shift ended, Sarah stepped outside, the cold hitting her like a wall. The man looked up, startled, fear flashing across his eyes, as if expecting to be chased away. She hesitated, heart pounding, then asked softly if he was okay. He laughed bitterly and said, "People who are okay don't sit outside freezing at midnight." His name was Thomas D. He'd lost his job weeks ago, then his room, and tonight the shelter was full. The wind cut sharper, and Sarah felt the blanket folded carefully in her bag, the one she always carried for late nights, the one she planned to use the moment she got home. Her hands trembled as she pulled it out. She told herself she could still buy another someday, that it was just a blanket, but it didn't feel like just anything. It felt like the last piece of comfort she owned. She wrapped it around Thomas's shoulders before she could change her mind. His eyes filled instantly, and he tried to refuse, saying she'd need it more. She shook her head, forcing a smile. She didn't quite feel, and told him warmth mattered more than memories when someone's life was on the line. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The streetlight flickered, snow beginning to fall, and something unspoken passed between them: loss, hope, all tangled together. Sarah walked away quickly, afraid she might turn back and take the blanket with her. By the time she reached her apartment, the cold inside felt unbearable. She curled up in her coat, shivering, wondering if she'd been foolish, wondering how she'd get through the night. But as she lay there, staring at the ceiling, she felt something else beneath the fear, a quiet sense of rightness, as if her mother were somewhere nearby, nodding. She didn't know it yet, but that single choice, made on an ordinary frozen night, was already setting something into motion. And before the sun rose, Sarah would learn that kindness given away has a way of finding its way back. The night stretched on longer than Sarah thought possible, every hour dragging like it was testing her resolve. The cold crept deeper into her apartment, seeping through the walls and settling into her chest until each breath felt thin and sharp. She lay awake, coat pulled tight, replaying the moment she'd wrapped the blanket around Thomas's shoulders. Doubt whispered to her in the dark, what if he sold it? What if it didn't make a difference? What if she needed it more than he did? But every time those thoughts rose, they were followed by the memory of his eyes, wide and glassy with disbelief, and the way his hands had clutched the fabric as if it were the most valuable thing he'd ever held. Around 2 a.m., a distant siren wailed and faded, and Sarah finally drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep. She dreamed of her mother standing at a bus stop in the snow, smiling and waving, the blanket folded over her arm. Sarah woke just before dawn, heart racing, the room gray and silent. Her first thought was of Thomas. She wondered if he'd found shelter, if the blanket had been enough to carry him through the night. As the sun began to rise, she made a decision she couldn't explain even to herself. She brewed weak coffee, wrapped herself in layers, and stepped back into the cold, retracing her steps toward the diner and the street where she'd last seen him. Snow crunched under her boots, the city slowly waking, unaware of the small worry driving her forward. When she reached the corner, her breath caught. The curb was empty. For a moment, panic flared. Had something happened to him? Then she noticed movement near the bus stop down the block. Thomas sat on the bench, the blanket wrapped tightly around him, his head resting against the glass. Relief flooded her so suddenly her knees almost gave way. She approached slowly, not wanting to startle him. When he saw her, his face changed, in a way she'd never forget, like someone who'd just seen proof that the world hadn't completely turned its back on him. He stood awkward and stiff, and thanked her again, his voice breaking as he admitted he hadn't slept so warmly in months. They talked as the morning grew brighter. Thomas told her pieces of his story, how one missed paycheck had led to another, how pride had kept him from asking for help until it was too late. Sarah listened, realizing how thin the line was between her life and his. Before they parted, she pointed him toward a church a few streets away that sometimes offered breakfast. He hesitated, then pressed something into her hand. It was a small, metal key, worn smooth. He told her it was the key to the room he'd lost, the last thing he'd kept to remind himself he belonged somewhere once. He said he didn't need it anymore because her kindness had reminded him that belonging wasn't a place, it was people. Sarah tried to refuse, but he insisted, saying, "Keep it. So you remember you saved me." She walked home shaken, the key heavy in her pocket, unaware that this exchange, this quiet transfer of hope, was only the beginning. Because while Sarah thought the night was finally over, the truth was, that single act of giving was already echoing through the city, reaching places she could never imagine. The day unfolded with an odd stillness, as if the world itself was pausing to consider what had happened. Sarah carried the small metal key with her everywhere, its weight a constant reminder of Thomas, and the choice she'd made. At work, she moved through her shift in a daze, smiling at customers without really seeing them, her thoughts drifting back to the bus stop bench and the way hope had flickered back to life in a stranger's eyes. During her break, she found herself staring out the diner window again, half expecting Thomas to appear, but the street was filled only with rushing cars and bundled pedestrians. That evening, as darkness crept in once more, the temperature dropped even lower. Sarah wrapped herself in layers and prepared for another cold night without the blanket, telling herself she'd manage. But as she reached her apartment building, she noticed an unfamiliar van parked outside, its hazard lights blinking softly. 2 volunteers stood nearby, unloading boxes marked with a logo of a local outreach program. Confused, Sarah slowed, and one of them approached her, asking if she lived in the building. When she nodded, he smiled warmly and explained they were delivering emergency winter supplies to residents identified as vulnerable during the cold snap. Before she could ask how her building had been selected, they handed her a thick, new blanket and a small care package with soup, gloves, and a handwritten note that read, "Kindness always finds its way back." Sarah's throat tightened. She thanked them, stepping inside with trembling hands, her heart pounding with a mix of disbelief and gratitude. That night, wrapped in warmth again, she thought of Thomas and wondered if he'd received help too, unaware that her kindness had already set something larger in motion. The next morning, a knock echoed through her apartment. When she opened the door, she found the building manager standing there, looking uncharacteristically serious. He told her someone had contacted him about an empty maintenance room in the basement that could temporarily house a person in need, complete with heat and a bed. The caller, he said, refused to give their name, only insisting it was urgent. Sarah felt a strange pull in her chest, a sense that she knew exactly who that caller was. Later that afternoon, as she walked through the city, she saw Thomas again, this time standing outside the church she'd mentioned, talking with a volunteer, the familiar blanket still around his shoulders. When he saw her, he smiled, but there was something different in his posture now, something steadier. He told her he'd met people who helped him get a temporary place to stay and a lead on work. He confessed that, after she left the night before, he'd walked until he found a phone and called every number he could remember, asking for help not just for himself, but for others still out in the cold. "I didn't want your kindness to stop with me," he said quietly. Sarah realized then that the blanket had been more than warmth, had been permission to hope, to act, to believe, again. As they parted, snow falling softly around them, she felt something shift inside her. She had given away her last comfort thinking it would end with a sacrifice. Instead it had multiplied, spreading through strangers, buildings, and heart. Still, she had no idea how far that ripple would go, or how profoundly the coming night would seal this story into her memory forever. By the time night fell again, the city felt transformed, as if the cold had uncovered something hidden beneath its usual rush. Sarah walked home slowly, the new blanket tucked under her arm, her thoughts tangled with everything that had happened since she'd given the old one away. The key Thomas had given her lay warm in her pocket, and she found herself rubbing it between her fingers like a charm. Outside her building, she noticed more activity than usual, neighbors talking in low voices, someone handing out cups of steaming tea, a quiet urgency in the air. Word had spread about the cold snap, and people, who rarely spoke, were suddenly checking on one another. Inside, Sarah learned that the basement room had been prepared. A small heater hummed, a narrow bed stood against the wall, and clean sheets had been tucked in carefully, as if someone wanted the space to feel like more than a temporary solution. Later that evening, Thomas arrived, guided by the building manager. When he saw the room, he stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes shining. He kept repeating that it was too much, that he didn't deserve it. But Sarah gently told him warmth and dignity weren't rewards, they were rights. He laughed softly at that, wiping his face with the sleeve of his sweater. They talked late into the night, sharing stories in the glow of the heater. Thomas spoke about the job he once loved, fixing things with his hands, and Sarah realized how skilled he was just by the way he described it. She talked about her mother, about the blanket she'd given away, and how it had been the last thing that made her feel safe. Thomas listened with care, as if holding her story as gently as she'd held his. Around midnight, the power flickered, plunging the basement into darkness. For a brief moment, fear surged, memories of the night before rushing back, but then emergency lights kicked in, casting a soft glow. In that stillness, Sarah felt something settle in her heart. She understood then that safety didn't come from objects alone, but from connection. When she finally went upstairs, she slept deeply for the first time in weeks. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the city in quiet. Somewhere in the building below, Thomas slept too, wrapped in warmth, not just from heaters and blanket, but from the knowledge that he mattered. The night passed without incident, but by morning, Sarah sensed that nothing would ever return to the way it was before. The cold had brought people together, and one simple act had rewritten the rhythm of their lives. Still, one final moment remained, one that would bind this night forever to the memory of kindness given and returned. Morning arrived gently, sunlight reflecting off the snow and filling the city with a quiet, almost sacred calm. Sarah woke with a strange mix of peace and anticipation, as if she knew this day would carry meaning beyond the ordinary. As she stepped outside, the cold no longer felt hostile. It felt clean, sharp, alive. Neighbors greeted one another with smiles that lingered, the shared experience of the night having softened something in everyone. In the basement, Thomas emerged looking rested, almost unrecognizable from the man she'd first seen shivering. On the curb, he held the old blanket carefully folded in his arm. He told her he'd stayed awake for a long time, thinking about how one small kindness had opened a door he thought was permanently closed. Before she could respond, a volunteer from the outreach program arrived with news. Thomas had been offered short-term work with a local repair shop that desperately needed extra hands during the winter. The owner, moved by his story, was willing to give him a chance. Thomas's voice broke as he thanked everyone, his gratitude spilling over in quiet tears. He turned to Sarah and handed the blanket back to her. She hesitated, but he smiled and said, "It carried me through the cold. Now it's time it came home." When she wrapped it around her shoulders, the familiar warmth and faint scent of memory returned, but it felt different, now lighter, shared. As the day unfolded, Sarah realized how deeply the night had changed her too. She understood that kindness wasn't about losing what little you had, it was about discovering how much you could give without becoming empty. Weeks later, the city thawed, and life settled into a new rhythm. Thomas found steadier work and eventually his own place. Sarah kept the key he'd given her on a hook by the door, a reminder that compassion can unlock futures you never expect. Sometimes, on especially cold nights, she would see Thomas volunteering with outreach teams, handing out blankets, sharing his story with those still in the shadows. The ripple had become a wave, and every time Sarah wrapped herself in that blanket, she remembered the night she thought she was giving away her last comfort, only to discover she was part of something far bigger. That night became unforgettable not because of the cold, but because of the warmth that answered it. And if this story moved you, Let it remind you that even the smallest act of kindness can change a life, sometimes many.